All right, whatever that parade was, it stopped. So let's start again. Basically, I'm switching through. I'm getting the current scene where we currently are, because remember, we're going home and back. We don't know which scene we're currently in. We read that information and we do a switch on it. The switch is a branching structure very similar to if-else. But in this case, I don't feel like doing if the name is this, if the name is that, if the name is this, if the name is that. That's cumbersome for me. I'd rather just use this switch statement. Each case, I know a definitive number of situations that it could be, because I'm the one that loaded up the scenes. So switch on the current scene.name. And case, if it's the title scene, you have to say case, and then I'm switching on a string, so we have to check a string. And we just do a colon, and then the lines underneath it are what happens. Then you break out. You break out from that case. You don't do the rest. If you don't have these breaks, you would go through them all. So right now I don't have do anything. Notice for tutorial, nothing, and level 1, do nothing. You could have a default statement too, like if none of this happens or something else, go do that. But I don't have a need for that. Now, I do have a need for this because not so much the text, although I do want to make sure I reset the text if I'm leaving and I'm re-entering, whatever. And I wasn't sure if I'm like completely wiping out the scene, or if I like at the end of the scene, if I leave the intro and I go back to the title, if it like kept the old information or wiped it out. That was one reason adding text. But my real reason is that I wanted to, when you're building the scene and you're trying to place stuff, I want to leave it all out. I want to see all my elements. But when I first jump into the intro, technically this back button shouldn't be here. So that's what I'm saying. Well, we have our intro text, and I have to link that. We have our image, and we have that back button. So what I want to just make sure is that this text is true. That not true, because it says the beginning one, right? It says the beginning one that the image is true and the back button is false. So let me say that I wanted to make sure that this image is turned on, because later on it gets turned off. And I want to make sure that this back button is turned off, but I still want to see it in the editor view. So this is my rationale anyway for having this awake, checking which scene I am, and then switching. And then down the road, I was thinking, oh, if I'm jumping back and forth a lot, I might want to do something similar like this in the tutorial scene in the level 1. So I'll make a switch statement. I'll check all these. I know that there is some initial setup I want to do at the intro scene, but I'm not sure about the others. So that's why I did this. So we're setting the text. Let's talk about that. So now I get to introduce this. So notice that the scene didn't have a public or private. That means it's private by default. It's a private data member. Only this class can access it. You don't want somebody else messing with it. Now this is public because I want to set it in the inspector. And I'll talk about the rest of this in a minute. But TMP underscore text is coming from TMP Pro. And I have to give it a name. I'm going to call it intro text. So when I say TMP text, it's this one here. It wants to know what the text element is. It's null. It says null when you first create it. But I actually reference it. I wanted to reference something because I want to change it. And I'm really talking about this here. This big block of text. I want to know what it is because I want to change it when I first jump in. And so I'm referencing this, welcome to Bubble Sort. And I'm referencing, what am I referencing of it? This component object. Not the game object, this component object of type Text Mesh Pro. Now notice it's the whole component which has many parameters, parts, what have you of it. But I'm really interested in changing the text, not the style, not the font, not the font size or the color of this text. I want to change the actual string, the text. So my first step, make a public variable of type this Text Mesh Pro text, give it some type of name so I can reference it later, make it public so that in the inspector, I could just drag it. I'm referencing this thing here, this big block of text. So that gets me to here, right? But this is referencing the component object, the class. I need to reference a data member. The dot operator references members of this class, either variables, public variables, or public methods. And this is this GetSet is a getter setter. It just simplify what it is. It's just a variable. It's basically a little helper function that lets you set variables. We don't need to go any more deeper in there. Just know that it's a string. It says string. And when you see GetSet, it's like shorthand for saying that you can read the variable and you can write onto the variable. You can get it and you can set it. And so technically, it's a method, but it's a shorthand way. And to make it an easy convention, you can kind of reference it like a variable. So I'm saying go get the text element inside this TextMesh Pro component object and set it equal to this string here. And that's this here. So yes, I set it here and I set it again, but I'm not sure if I'm jumping in and out if I need to reset it when I re-enter the intro. So that's why it's there. But it allows me to say, here's a string, and here's a new line character and a new line. It's like pressing the enter key in a Word doc. Now notice that there's a big space here. There's actually two spaces. You return and return again, and I wanted that nice big space between them. That's why there's two new line characters. It's a double space. So this is a string added to a string called, and when you add strings together, it's called concatenation. And basically it's one larger string. You can write this all out as one big string, like this. But it's kind of hard to read when there's this spacing in here. What it really means is this is one sentence, there's two return lines, and then a whole new sentence. So to make it easier to read, even though those are technically the same things, I do this. Here's a string for one sentence. Give me my new lines. Give me a concatenator or an addition. Give me another line. It's easier for me to parse out these sentences this way anyway. So it's just a preference. So intro image SetActive true. All right, intro image. Again, we have public game object, intro image. So in this case, I want a variable type game object, because what do I want to do with this? I just want to turn this on and off. And yes, I could turn it on and off at the image component, or I could go into here and null this out, or take the color, probably is what I have to do, and set the color alpha to 0. And turn off here, but just, it's a very standard convention, and you just grab game objects and you turn them on and off as needed. All right, so to be able to do this by code, I have to say public game object my intro image, and then when you save that, it'll pop out here on the inspector and say intro image. Okay, so there's some game object that you want to reference that we're going to call the intro image. And who do you want to reference? Well, I want this bubble sort illustration. I want this image to reference because I want to turn it on and off via code. So if I go down here, you can see intro image.setActive. This is a method that allows you to turn game objects on and off based on what you pass in. So if SetActive false, it would turn that game object off. And I do that later on. And once we get past the first sequence, the first step in our sequence of the intro, I do turn this off. So I turn it on to begin with. But the real reason, if you want me to really know why I wrote this script, it's this right here. I still want to see the back button when I'm in the editor, but when I'm in play mode and I first jump in here, I want this thing off. So even before I click the next button, even before anything happens, I want this thing off. This is the real reason I made this code. So public game object back button, right? Public, so that I can come up in here and I can reference it. and it's referencing this here. And I just want to turn this off when I first jump in and turn it back on later on. So back button down here, back button.setActive false. So with all that, I should be able to click play, and the back button gets turned off, and everything else is fine. All right. So that's back button SetActive false. And this was all going through the awake function. We started, and you saw it, and it read which scene we're in, and it just turned it off. Great. So let me talk briefly about this stuff. So you're seeing that we have a bunch of public variables up here, and then some private variables. I always get properties and fields confused. I think if they're, field. I think if they're private, they're called fields, and I think if they're public, they're called properties. And I could be wrong, but I just call them public variables, private variables. But they're also, you might hear terms like properties and fields and variables, and they're all kind of talking about the same thing. And data members, it's just their nature of this data. Is it private? Is it public? How's it being used? But notice these are all public, and the reason for that is I wanted to start to use them out in the inspector to just connect them to. Now this script gets used in all the scenes, and if you notice I jump over to the title scene, I don't want to save it. These fields are still expressed, they're still shown, but they're empty. So in this scene, they're just not used, and over an intro scene, they are used. Now I wanted to start to make a distinction between which scene we're in. And if you notice here, it says header, intro scene properties. All right. So if I look over here, you see here's something in bold, and it doesn't have like something to connect to it. It's just a string. It's just some text. Intro scene properties, right? So you can place down what are called headers. Now, we use this, you notice I have headers, I got spaces. You can use these property attributes to called serialized field is a common thing you'll see. But anyway, these are ways to give instructions into the inspector and treat it more like a GUI. And so you see headers and spaces, and there's text fields and tooltips. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. But basically, these square brackets are giving instructions or a command. And if I hover over it, you can see it's saying these are property attributes that you can give to fields in the inspector. And the inspector is back in Unity. So this is basically saying create a header or a string, like a head of a body, just like a big font, because I want to place some instructions down in the inspector. I'm always trying to build a small little GUI right in the inspector. So I have a header called title scene properties, a space of 2, a size of 2, and that 2 is, I don't know, some arbitrary height amount, and another header, and then we have some headers down here. I don't think those headers showed up yet. No, you need variables within them for the headers to show. So notice I've just started building out variables that are used in the intro scene, and since this script is used in all 4 scenes, I have headers now for all 4. So it tells the developer, it's more user-friendly on the developer side what's going on. I know that these variables only relate to the intro scene, and that's why when we're over in the title scene, they're empty. And the user doesn't see it, it's just for me. And I put a little space in there just to start spacing out, and the variables will go in here as needed for the title scene. And because there's no variables down here, the other headers aren't shown yet. But once I do pop variables in there, fields or whatever, they'll start to be populated. And headers have this weird thing that when you have a few headers in a row, they actually will like flip their order. It's just the weird way that these property attributes work. So notice there's order. Order 0 means he goes first, order 1 next. There's an assorting order to these headers, just so they appear correctly in the inspector. So that's what all of this means. Is, since this script, this canvas, this UI, functionality script is going to be used in several scenes, I'm going to have variables I need for different scenes. Why don't I put some headers in there and start to, so people make some sense of what's going on with this. So that explains that. I've explained this. Let me explain the next button before I explain the back button. So I was like, okay, I got this next button. How do I want to move through this intro sequence? And again, there's more than one way. This is just the way I did it. Feel free to do it another way. So I create a public method, void, it returns nothing. There's no input coming in, called intro sequence next. I could have called it like next button or whatever. But in this case, it's saying it's like the next command in the intro sequence. So intro sequence next. And notice that the next button actually is calling that. So it's referencing the Canvas game object, the Canvas UI functions, and it's referencing intro sequence next. When you click it, it's just calling that method. There's no input, there's nothing else to put, it just calls that method. So what's happening? First off, there's intro sequence. So I could have called it intro sequence count, whatever, but it's an integer, it's private. It defaults to 0 when you don't set it to anything, so it's defaulting to 0 to start with. And it's just a way for me to count through where am I in this sequence. So what am I doing? So notice that when the next button is clicked, first we increment it. So plus plus is the same as saying this variable equals this variable plus 1. Add 1 to whatever we're currently at. So we start at 0, we increment it by 1. So position 0 is really this. It's up here. We instantiate the whole intro scene to this. This is really like position 0. Even before we hit the next button, I needed a way to instantiate stuff, so I did it up here in awake. So we click the next button. This goes from 0 to 1. Then we do a switch, and wherever we're at, I can do different instructions. So we're in a branching sequence, branching mechanism. Again, I could have done this with a series of if statements. I didn't feel like it. I'm kind of partial to switches, but do what you want. So in this case, we're switching on an integer. So case 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So we have 11 steps through our intro. And we can go back and forward with this. But let's just cover it next right now. So case 0, and I only had to add this later because the back button actually goes back some steps. So I'm going to cover this later because we actually don't need this until we get to the back button. So I'm going to cover case 1. This is the first real thing that we go into. We hit the next button, intro sequence increments by 1. We do a switch on it. We're at case 1. So what's happening? Intro image gets turned off, back button gets turned on. So this here, the illustration gets turned off, the back button gets turned on, because remember, by default it gets turned off. It's only here right now because I want to look at it in the editor. And we're taking the horizontal alignment of the text and putting it to align left. So the reason for that is it's actually taking this alignment right here. Notice when I put it to the left, it does this. I could have started with that. I didn't like it. These little intro statements kind of look better when they're center justified and it centers up with the button or the image and all this and that. So I like starting off like this. But all the other text, I was doing it center justified and it just didn't look good. These big blocks of text are bullet points lists. And paragraphs, they just don't look good center justified. And so I went with left justified, which is what's like in the endpoint deliverable. So anyway, that's why I say, okay, we're in case 1. I'm going to align to the left because we were center justified. And then I'm going to set the text. So the overview was like a series of bullet points, or titles. And so this is how I ended up doing. This is my title. It says overview. We're going to double space it. We're going to move to the next line. Title, bubble sort in 3D. New line, platform, WebGL. New line, subject, computer science. New line, subsubject, sorting algorithms. New line, main focus, bubble sort. New line, learning level, grades 6 to 12. And remember, these are concatenations. So we could do this with one big massive string, but it's very hard to read in code. So I don't do that. And then we break out. We don't execute any of the rest of this. So what does that look like? So click next. Overview. Left justified. We go back. We're in our first step. So maybe I can cover the back button now, but next, overview. This looks very similar to how it looks in our endpoint. That's why I did it this way. And it's left justified. And the back button got turned on. And the intro image disappears. Back button on, intro image off, left justified, overview. Since I clicked the back button, why don't we cover that next? So back button. Actually, I just want you to look in the hierarchy. As I move back and forth, notice back button's turned off and image is turned on. Notice as I jump back and forth, which one gets dim gray. So I want you to notice when game objects are enabled or disabled. All right. So we have our back button. Let's see, I'm 20 minutes in. Should I keep going? I'm going to take a break and continue on.